Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Lani Kim, and I'm a life coach here at Life Coach University. And Life Coach University's goal really is to pay it forward. So you're here benefiting from these different workshops that we offer. And our ask is that you pay it forward in whatever way that you want, whatever way feels good to you. But we do ask you to pay it forward. And it could be as simple as looking through the calendar of the upcoming workshops and sharing it with someone. Maybe you have a friend, a family member, um, coworker that you think could benefit from one of these workshops, and maybe you even attend together. And so our one ask is that you pay it forward. So I'm Lani Kim, and I'm a life coach. I work with primarily women in some kind of leadership role. Very often, my clients are moms who are transitioning, maybe from staying at home for a time and looking to go back into a leadership role, or they've been at a kind of mom-friendly job and they're looking to elevate their position, or maybe they're empty nesting and really wanting to use that time to focus on their career. So welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to chat about changing your point of view for your benefit. This session is going to be, I think, a little bit different than if you've been to my other webinars or watched them. Um, I really want to give you space to work on this as we chat about it. I really want you to experience that changing of your point of view, your perspective. And so I want you to think about a situation that you currently are in. If you can do that, that would be most beneficial. If you're absolutely stuck on something to think about, maybe think about a past situation as recently as possible where it involved other people and you felt a great sense of frustration. Or maybe the interaction with you and the other person or other people was not ideal. And we're going to take this time to go through it with you as if you're in the situation currently, or to revisit that. And the reason that this is so powerful is because very often our brains, well, not very often, our brains are lazy by nature. And so when there's anything that seems like it's hard work, our brains are going to throw up some resistance. And really, where I want to help you is to start to form pathways and processes and thought processes to help you get around these blocks. How do you start to consciously practice ways to get through these challenges so that that process, that stream of thought becomes more practice, just like working out, and to the point where it becomes muscle memory. But for you, obviously, more like a process memory, a thought memory, so that it comes more easily and you're more easily able to step in to that process or that thought process of how do you get through these situations where they're not going the way that you imagined and it's not feeling so great. Um, and so what I want you to first think about is obviously find that situation, but in general, remember that we have a narrative in our head, and there's a narrator, and then there's the person listening. And so often what happens is we have this greater sense of self. And then we have our brain chatter, our mind chatter. And very often we listen to our mind chatter because it's loud, right? Very often that mind chatter comes from our kind of fight or flight response. And this is why very often in situations we don't act, respond the way we want to, right? We more react. We don't respond. We're reacting. And so that voice, though, is so loud and it's so quick to give us something to say or a way to act, rather than our conscious brain, which is a little bit slower. It's more thoughtful, more purposeful. So because it starts to think about different, well, points of view, perspectives, it takes a little longer to spit out kind of an answer for you, right? A thought for you to think. And so we have to be careful about who's narrating the situation and who's listening to the situation, right? So what I mean by that is we are so often listening to that quick, um, unconscious stream of thought, right? So your lower brain functions, your kind of primitive brain is very quick with reactions, right? That's why when something comes flying at your face, you duck, right? You don't kind of sit there and think, how big is that object? How quickly is it coming at me, right? You duck as fast as you can, unless maybe you're playing a sport like baseball and you're trained at that, right? You duck. And so that often is the voice that we first hear, right? And it's very loud because it has to do with our safety. And we start to listen to that voice and let it take over. Instead of our higher brain functions, our prefrontal cortex, that does our more thoughtful thinking and allowing that to have a voice too, right? And yes, that is when we practice that, right? What does our primitive primal brain sound like, and what does our prefrontal cortex higher brain function brain sound like, right? We have to get to know kind of those two different personalities. And when we start to get to know those two different personalities, we really get to understand which one is talking to us, right? And I think about it almost like identical twins, which, most identical twins have very different personalities. I don't think I've ever met a set of identical twins that have very similar personalities. If anything, I think often because they try to differentiate themselves with their personality, they're almost like polar opposites. And so I think of, a thought we think is, what's a thought? It comes from my brain. It's just, it is what it is. It's just a thought, right? But no, you have your primitive brain, you have your prefrontal cortex, your higher brain functions, and they have two different personalities, two different functions. And we have to get to know each one. Yes, they're housed in the same skull. And if you look at our brain, it is, one muscle, one organ, but there's actually different parts of it, right? If you study the brain, it's broken up in different sections. And so you have these two main thinking parts. And when we can identify them, right, kind of like as teaching, I've had twins in my classes. And so, you get to know their personalities, and especially if they are dressed alike, you get to know, oh, when you see one of the twins and you watch the interaction or the way they're acting, you're like, oh, it's probably that twin, right? Because you get to know their personalities. Well, that thought might come to you as a thought. How do I know which is which, where it's coming from? Well, you'll get to know them. You get to know yourself and what kind of what that personality of your primitive brain is, the personality of your prefrontal cortex is, your higher brain functions, right? And so I say this because this interaction, right, this power dynamic between your primitive brain and your prefrontal cortex really is going to start really not start to, it's going to dictate that journey of this experience that you are having or have had, or dictated that experience that you had, right? And the kind of the outcome of what happened after that, right? And really how you felt about yourself in that situation. Because if you're listening to your primitive brain, it probably did not go the way you wanted it to. And not just what happened along the way, but how you felt afterwards. Because our primitive brain really is the brain of lack. It's like we have to conserve because we're not going to have enough energy. We have to eat enough because we're not going to have enough food. We have to run away because we're not fast enough in something, or we're not safe enough, so something might get us. So it's really the lack brain, your brain of where we can see abundance in resources is really our prefrontal cortex. So we have these two differing, I think of them as like dueling banjos, right? Dun, 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 right? And they're trying to play off. And it's all sounding like music. It's all sounding like thoughts, right? But it's coming from two different sources. And so which one are we listening to? Which one do we allow to be the louder one, which is really, which is the one that is creating the, music's not my background, but melody, right? And which one is coming along and just playing the harmony, right? So if you are letting your lack brain, your primitive brain, be the melody, right? The signature of the conversation that you're having, and then your prefrontal cortex is just kind of harmonizing with that, right? Rather than your prefrontal cortex being the melody, right? And your primitive brain might just be there kind of in the background playing the melody. Harmony. So that's really kind of the foundational pieces of this. Like, where are you coming from? So actually, the hardest part of this work is really working with that foundation, right? Of getting to know these two brains that you have and knowing their patterns, right? And when I say patterns, I mean what thoughts start to come into your head with each different brain, right? Or each different personality. And what not only thoughts that you have, but what experience are you having, right? So meaning, what does it start to feel like in your body, right? Are you coming up with this kind of like, for me, it's like this tight chest, really high, like I need to be heard, right? Or is it more, and I think of like I'm leaning forward, I'm taking a step forward, like I want you to hear me type of posture experience. Whereas when I am in my primitive brain and I'm slowing down, being more thoughtful, and actually kind of emptying, not so much emptying, but not being curious, right? And not going just with my initial thoughts about the situation. I'm listening and I'm open and curious as to what the other person is thinking, right? So I think it more of the way it manifests in my body is really like in my lower region, my hips, like they feel very firm and grounded. And I feel more like I'm giving the person space, right? It's like a leaning back type of energy, like, okay, what I want to listen to you. What do you have to say, right? And so that's the experience that I have kind of in my body when I'm in, with each different brain. So it manifests physically in my body. And then when I'm in lack, my heartbeat starts to quicken and I feel like oh, like, when the other person is talking, my heart beats fast, beating faster and faster. And I feel like I just gotta throw out these words out of my mouth. Like I'm just holding them in and my heart's beating faster. It's like, get it out, get it out, get it out. Right. And then when I'm listening, right, I wouldn't say my heartbeat slows down, but the way it manifests in my body is like more like a steady, strong beat. The way I think about it is back to the music analogy is like a metronome. Duh, 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 right? Just real steady, right? And it's not, and a metronome is kind of this neutral thing, right? It's just keeping beat. It's not there to reprimand you. It's not telling you to speed up or slow down. It's just there, right? It's a point of reference. And so just that steady heartbeat is like, okay, I know I'm in my most neutral place, right? So what does that look like for you? And if you have a pen and paper handy, really it's going to be helpful if you can kind of take note of these different things, like foundationally, just where do you want to be? Not even trying to really take out tools and start to change your perspective, but you really got to need to get to know yourself first to even kind of layer this other work onto it. So, first of all, remember that you have two personalities or two brains, right? And then what happens with each brain? What is their personality, right? What thoughts do you tend to hear from each personality? And then what does it feel like in your body physically? What does that experience look like physically in your body? And the third part of that is emotionally. Okay, so yes, so emotions, when we say feelings, I think it's kind of an interesting word um, because really we're talking about feelings as in physical sensations, and then there's emotions, right? So an emotion is basically the way we define an experience, right? That's in our bodies and paired with thoughts. So an emotion is going to start with some thoughts and then start to manifest into some kind of sensations in our bodies. So understanding what your thought is, what the different thoughts are, what the different physical experiences are. Now you've got to start to name and pair these together, right? Okay, when I'm having this thought, I start to feel this certain way in my body. Oh, that's frustration, right? Or this thought causes this sensation or feeling in my body, and that is anxiety, right? So start to put these together. The way I think about it is really, if you, when you're in elementary school, you often have those tests where it has something on one side, maybe definitions, and then it has words on the other, and you draw a line and you connect them, right? So what I'm saying is, what are your thoughts? What are the different sensations you're feeling in your body? Match them up and then start to label what is that emotion now, that thought and that feeling in your body, that physical feeling in your body. Start to match them up so you could name that emotion. And the reason naming it is so important is it gives it an identity. And now we can start to depersonalize actually that emotion, right? So if I say, oh, I'm having these thoughts, I'm feeling these things, right? It feels very personal, right? But when we are having an emotion and we can identify it, we can start to practice putting it outside of ourselves and like, oh, okay, anger is happening, right? Um, so what do I do about that, right? And then from there, you come up with your game plan as to how you're not going to deal with it, right? So it's just this set of thoughts and physical sensations paired together, and you're just naming it. And then you can now have a process on how you want to move forward out of the anger, right? What is your process? And the more defined that we are, the quicker it is for us to create that, to identify that process and then start to put it into place, right? So, like I said, so if it's frustration, right? So, frustration for me is almost like a tightness in my gut, and almost like a buzzing above my shoulders. That's just how it manifests for me. That I can identify as frustration. And the thoughts behind that are, can't you just, for my kids, I've said this so many times. And so, what does that look like for you? But when I can identify it as frustration, I have my game plan on what do I do moving forward instead of continuing down that path of frustration. I have to give myself a place to land. So other thoughts that I need to have, right? So if you know anything about habits, when we are trying to put one habit aside, we need to pick up another one because our brains need to go somewhere. So if you're not doing this, what else are you doing, right? So if I'm not feeling frustration, if I'm not thinking, I told you a million times, why does this keep happening? Then I have to think something else. And so we have to have a game plan. So for me, frustration, and it's different, right, with different people, but if we could just categorize it, right? So with my kids, um, the question I have in my head is, what is preventing you from doing what I'm asking you? Right. And that's kind of the question I have in general. But with my kids, it's more direct. It's just like, okay, what's going on? Like, what is the gap here? And listening to that. With adults, I mean, there's different situations. There's friends, right? There's family, there's coworkers. So the narrative might look a little bit different, but overall, it's just asking them kind of that same question of what's going on, but, oh, okay. So do you want to explain this project? Can you tell me um, what happened after you did, A or B or C, right? And just giving, number one, my brain time to slow down and not react and get into a listening mode. But also when we are asking people questions out of curiosity, that sets the tone for the conversation, right? Like you are listening to them. You're not coming to them, with this barrage of even, they may be questions, but they may be aggressive questions, right? And negatively framed questions, but really like, okay, you did this, great. What happened from there, right? Instead of like, why did this happen? Right? It's a totally different feel to it. So that's really where you want to find yourself, right? Setting this foundation of really getting into the two personalities of your brain, and then identifying those habits, kind of habits that you already have in your primitive brain and then your prefrontal cortex, and then starting to create the processes to change when you are in your primitive brain, right? A different mode, a different gear, right? If you're driving a car, maybe you don't want to be in first gear, right? But you have to switch into another gear or the car's not going to go. So what does that gear look like, right? And so having a narrative, or not a narrative, thoughts that go with where you want to be. And then identifying what feels good in your body to then take action, right? So examining your prefrontal cortex and examining, how do you feel when you're in your higher brain? Right? What does it feel? Because that's going to be familiar to your body, and that's going to feel good in your body. So now these thoughts that you're thinking, instead of bringing your primitive brain, these thoughts that you want to grab onto are those creating the physical experience that you want, right? That's similar probably to your how you're feeling in your prefrontal cortex. Um, and even just getting familiar with that feeling of being in your prefrontal cortex will also help you identify that point where you're like, okay, I'm in a good place to keep moving forward, right? So one of the things that we have to be cautious of, or not so much cautious, but is a good checkpoint, is when you are in your primitive brain, your um, um, your your lack brain, your brain that thinks from lack. Are you continuing to try to move forward, right? Because at that point, when you're interacting with someone else, you might just want to have a narrative that helps you stay in a holding pattern, right? Because you don't want to end up with the end goal in a negative place, right? You just kind of want to give yourself time and space to be like, okay, I need to switch into a different mode. And over time, some scenarios are going to become so practiced it doesn't take, but a millisecond. And some are going to take, it'll seem like minutes, but literally maybe like 5 seconds just to change yourself into that prefrontal cortex. But um, making this a more holistic type of feeling, right? And not trying to move forward as you're feeling, upset and anxious, right? But keeping yourself like kind of like, okay, I know I'm not coming from the greatest place. Let's just kind of stay here. And what I mean by that also is, again, this is a good time to have a couple of questions that you ask the other person or other people. And as they talk, that'll give your brain a little more time to slow down, and not trying to put out those primitive brain thoughts, right? But just switch gears, still letting the conversation happen, but making also the other people feel like you're listening to them and giving them space, right, to talk. And then, using that time to switch into your prefrontal cortex, right, and get into the process of, okay, I'm feeling frustration. What do I want to do from there? What does this process look like for me? And the what I find so helpful is to journal a couple of scenarios that you are either in or have happened in the past, and really go through this exercise and then say, okay, where do I want to be? And to do that work, right? Of, okay, this is where I was, this is where I want to be, and bridging that gap of, okay, this is what it felt like in my body, but this is where I want to be. These are the thoughts I was having. These are the thoughts that help my body get into my prefrontal cortex, my higher brain functions. And the past is really powerful because we have that experience to draw upon. And so, especially if there's situations that occur very often, right? So that would be my encouragement. What are the kind of scenarios you find yourself in often, and journal about those. And just like athletes, right? They are practicing, practicing for a game that's not even real, right? Or even they might be practicing one skill and they're not even kind of in the game mode. They're just practicing a skill. This is really what you're doing when you're journaling and going through these scenarios, is really creating that mental muscle memory. And so it actually is your neurons firing in your head, and you're creating new pathways when you practice this. And as you practice it more and more, you're actually strengthening those pathways. So what happens is when you strengthen these pathways, the other pathway that your brain might have gone, right? So frustration might be one, and then peaceful might be what you're looking for as the alternative. As you strengthen this peaceful one, your pathway of frustration is actually going to start to deteriorate. that neural connection is going to become weaker. And so this is not just a pretend and play type of scenario. It actually creates changes in your brain, and then that's going to change your experience in your thoughts and in your body, right? And so that is a super powerful way to go about this. And what I would invite you to do, if this is all new to you, is just pick one. Just pick one scenario that, if you're in it currently, great, use that scenario. But if it's in the past, find something that was either very, very powerful in your life, or pick a scenario that has been reoccurring, and set aside a time to just go through this, right? And I'm talking like 2 minutes. 1 minute getting familiar with what happened, and then 1 minute practicing what you would do in the future. And to even go a little bit deeper than that is to pair it with something you already do. I find brushing my teeth is a great way for me to do a lot of these things, right? It's something we've got to do. And a lot of us do that first thing in the morning, or kind of sometime in the morning, start off the day with brushing our teeth. And so it's a good way to kind of get your brain to where you want it to be in the morning. And, brushing your teeth, you're kind of not doing anything else. Probably you don't have your phone out with you. And if you do, well, leave it by your bedside and go brush your teeth and practice this, right? And that's kind of how long it should take, is the time it takes to brush your teeth, or maybe brush your teeth, floss, and mouthwash, right? And so this is a really good time to practice it. And most of the time, people aren't bothering you when you're doing this. If you're a mom, that's one of the few times I feel like my kids leave me alone because I can't answer them because I've got, something in my mouth. Whereas if I'm doing something, getting ready, doing something else, my kids are like, oh, this is the time to talk to mom because I have her undivided attention because she's getting ready. So brushing my teeth for me is a really good time for me to practice these different things. And so the hardest thing about this is really committing to it, because the results are going to come quickly. They're not going to, they may be immediate in the sense of you have that self-awareness as you're going through it, and you might be like, oh, I could have paused at that point, or oh, I should have done this at that point, which is a step above where you probably have been. But for it to be really practiced and not so effortful is going to take time. So it's going to take a commitment, because your brain's going to tell you, oh no, this is really hard and the results aren't coming quickly, just like exercise, right? I want to see those results right away. So you just need to remain committed. And what I would say is pick a time period of just committing to doing this, right? And then waiting to see if it's manifested um, into your life. So I would say for me, 10 is always something that I kind of go towards, or 2 weeks. So 2 weeks or 10 days, whichever works for your brain better. Just commit to that for 10 days. That's 2 minutes a day, just 20 minutes, or for 2 weeks, right? So 2 minutes, 14 days, 20 minutes, and that's less than half an hour. um, just commit to that, right? And don't set the expectation that you're going to see a result immediately. Commit only to doing that work and not expecting a result. Because really expecting the result is when we falter and get really frustrated with ourselves. Right? So just commit, just really micro focused on those 2 minutes a day. Just focus on that. Don't go beyond that. Don't come out with some expectation, especially if you have an expectation and then you start to beat yourself up about it. Like, oh, but I practiced that. I should have. Why didn't I? And then getting that frustration, right? So just commit to just those 2 minutes, nothing beyond that. Okay, so I wanted to go into really this is like the glass half empty or half full, right? So I'm talking about how is this benefiting you? So hopefully everything I've mentioned so far is going to benefit you, right? And you could see that. But I wanted to talk to you about really how that perspective that we have in a real, not maybe a real life situation, but a situation that we can understand, how our perspective is so powerful, right? So I'm going to give you a situation in 3 different ways. So the situation looks like this. You are given $50. Okay, so, or dollars. I don't know if bucks is a Western thing, or an American thing. $50. So you just imagine you are, I don't know, with a friend, and your friend somehow got a bonus out at work, or won some money somehow, right? And is just wanting to outpour, give it, let that pour out from them and be generous. They give you $50, right? $50 in your hand, $50. How does that feel? Like how does it feel? What thoughts are going through your head? For me, I'd be like, oh, it's like a little pop of like, um, I don't know, like almost like tension, and then letting it go, like, oh, what? Oh yeah, that's exciting. And then like a deep sense of like, whew, like, wow, you wanted to share with me. That's really nice. That's really kind. That's really thoughtful. I'm really grateful for that. And then the thoughts are like, oh gosh, I mean, I kind of want to pay it forward with this $50 because it's bonus, and maybe I want to take my kids out and my husband out for dessert, right? Or maybe my kids' friends are over and I want to take them out for dessert. Or maybe my husband and I go out for an unexpected dinner out, right? Or a meal out. So that's kind of what my experience would be. Okay, so sit in that. Now, that same friend, you learn that he has got a bonus of $1 million. And he is giving you $50. Um, and check yourself to see if that changes your experience, knowing how much he got. And then here's the next thing to see. maybe you guys are meeting for coffee and he gives you the $50 and you're like, oh my gosh, that's so cool, right? He tells you his bonus was $1 million. I don't know, does that change your experience? Then he tips the guy who brought him coffee $100. He gave you 50. He tipped the guy 100. Now, does that change your experience? For me, it does, if I'm really honest. If I really put myself in those scenarios, right? My gut reaction. So, so my purpose in this is really to see how your perspective can be so different in the same situation. I know to you, you're saying, but that's not the same situation because I know now. No, the first time you were given $50, what if you just never knew how much she was given? Or what if you guys were having coffee, he gave you the $50, you left, and then he tipped the either barista or server? You would never know, right? And so, but which scenario, right, would you really ultimately want to be in? Which gave you the better experience? But we can do that. We can just focus on that one thing, the $50 that we get to use however we choose, right? So maybe it's not even for you. Maybe it's not even taking other people out. Maybe it's taking care of yourself. Maybe you've been looking at your nails and it's like, oh my gosh, I haven't taken care of myself. And it's showing that excitement to be able to do that for yourself, right? Versus now saying like, oh, well, geez, if I had that $100, I'd be able to get my nails done and maybe get a trim on my hair that I've really been needing. So that really is an exercise I love to go through because it really highlights and illustrates the power of perspective. Okay. And just being able to focus on our portion and not trying to control or looking at the other um, parts of the circumstance. And so the reason I say this also is when you have that $50 and it's just freely given to you, think of how you thought of spending it. And then think of having the $50 after learning either how much your friend actually got or after watching him tip someone $100, that change in how you would spend that $50, right? So maybe this didn't happen for you, but the first time the $50, I wanted to pass it on. I wanted to share it with others. I wanted to do something maybe extraordinary of how I would normally spend my own $50. Then the second and third, well, maybe the third scenario, more likely the third scenario. Then I felt like, oh, I more wanted to not keep it to myself, but maybe save it, right? And so that is really how you also use your resources around you, which also affects the outcomes of when you're working with people, right? So how are you using your resources, right? If you're in a brain of lack, you're trying not to use resources, right? When you're in a abundance mindset, your prefrontal cortex is where that feeling comes from. It's really like, oh, how do we use our resources, right, to create something in the future, right? So for me, being able to share dessert creates joy, more joy for me, not just receiving the money, but giving it away, or not giving, I mean, using it and seeing that joy of other people enjoying. Um, I love that feeling, right? But if I'm just holding it and saving it, I'm not saying that saving money is a bad thing. I'm just saying, though, right, this unexpected bit, it kind of just stops right there, right? I'm not using those resources. So when you are changing your point of view, you're very much getting into, again, are you saying in your brain, lack brain, or your brain, your prefrontal cortex, where this abundant mindset comes from? So your whole interaction with the person, other person, or people is completely different, right? And I think when you're working with people, very often we um time, right? Sometimes we could feel like we lack time, like you've got to, if you're working in a team and you have a project you're working on and you're looking at the timing of things, or like, you got to get this done because we don't have enough time for you to take more time, right? You've got to get this done in this amount of time. We don't have time for it to take any longer, right? It's like this lack. Where when you come from a mindset of abundance, and time isn't a finite thing that people have to work within, right? More you work with time, then that's when you get into more a collaborative mode. How do we help each other? If I spend time understanding maybe one of the people on your project, understanding really where their stuck point is, you might spend, yes, maybe half an hour there, but maybe after that session, they could go solve it in 15 minutes rather than them sitting there because you're not listening to them for 2 hours because they're frustrated and not understanding really how to move forward, right? And so it really changes your complete dynamic, your complete interaction with the person you're working with or the people you're working with, right? Um, and so just being able to have that change of perspective. Um, and what I would say too is, how do you now, like, what are some techniques you can use to start to create these new processes? Um, and I would say, stop complaining, um, follow your trail of happiness, like that $50. How do you follow that into happiness rather than like lack, right? And the third one is to edit negative self-talk, right? There's actually evidence that it's not so much the positive talk, but more the negative self-talk, how much negative self-talk that we have. But obviously, when we're in positive self-talk, that lessens the amount of negative time we spend in negative talk. So that's really where the gold is in changing your point of view for your benefit. Thank you so much for being here. This is Life Coach University, and we just ask that you pay it forward in some way.